The howling wind carried Eleanor Vaughn's desperate screams across the barren, snow-covered plains of Montana territory. But no one was there to hear her pleas as the stagecoach disappeared into the blizzard, abandoning her to the merciless winter of 1877. She collapsed to her knees, her wedding dress now soaked with melting snow, the reality of her situation hitting her with the same brutal force as the icy gale that threatened to knock her off her feet. Roy Dawson had been tracking the stagecoach for the better part of the day, worried about anyone foolish enough to brave the worst blizzard Jefferson, Montana had seen in decades. The 32-year-old rancher pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, squinting through the curtain of white. He'd left his two young children, 8-year-old Thomas and 6-year-old Sarah, with Mrs. Wilson, their elderly neighbor, promising he'd return before nightfall. But the howling storm had other plans, disorienting him until a sound cut through the wailing wind, a woman's cry. Eleanor's fingers had long since gone numb, her expensive gloves offering little protection against the biting cold. The tears freezing on her cheeks were bitter reminders of her naivete. Charles Blackstone had seemed like the perfect gentleman when he'd courted her back in Boston, wealthy, charming, and eager to make her his bride. She'd traveled all the way to Montana to marry him, only to discover the truth too late. The moment she arrived in Jefferson, she'd overheard him discussing his plans with a companion, how he'd secured her family's money, and had no intention of going through with the marriage. When she'd confronted him, he'd simply laughed, ordered the driver to continue, and pushed her from the stagecoach into the blinding snow. "Hello," Roy called out, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. "Anyone out here?" Eleanor raised her head, hope flickering in her heart. "Help." She managed, her voice weak from the cold. "Please help me." Roy followed the sound, his horse carefully picking its way through the deepening snow. When he finally spotted her, a crumpled figure in white, his heart seized. He dismounted quickly, crossing the distance between them with urgent strides. "Madam, what in God's name are you doing out here?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Eleanor looked up at the bearded face of her would-be rescuer. His eyes, a startling blue against his weather-beaten skin, held concern rather than judgment. "I was abandoned," she managed through chattering teeth. Roy didn't waste time on further questions. He removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. "We need to get you somewhere warm and fast," he said, helping her to her feet. "My ranch is closest. Can you ride?" She nodded weakly, allowing him to lift her onto his horse before he mounted behind her. As they rode through the blinding snow, Eleanor leaned back against Roy's chest, drawing warmth from his solid presence. Despite the dire circumstances, she felt an inexplicable sense of safety in this stranger's arms. The journey to Roy's ranch seemed endless, the cold seeping deeper into Eleanor's bones with each passing minute. She drifted in and out of consciousness, only vaguely aware of Roy's deep voice murmuring reassurances in her ear. When they finally arrived at a modest homestead, she was barely conscious. Roy carried her inside, calling out as he entered. "Mrs. Wilson, I've brought someone who needs help." An elderly woman appeared from another room, her eyes widening at the sight of the half-frozen bride in Roy's arms. "Good heavens! Bring her by the fire, quickly." Roy gently placed Eleanor on a chair near the roaring hearth. "She was abandoned in the storm," he explained to Mrs. Wilson, "in a wedding dress of all things." Mrs. Wilson clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "What kind of monster would do such a thing? The poor dear is nearly frozen through." She began removing Eleanor's sodden outer garments. "You best check on the children while I get her into something dry." Roy nodded, reluctantly leaving the room. His thoughts remained with the mysterious woman even as he quietly opened the door to his children's bedroom. Thomas and Sarah were sound asleep, their faces peaceful in the soft glow of the oil lamp. Looking at them, Roy felt the familiar ache of loss. They'd been without a mother for almost 3 years now, since Catherine had succumbed to fever. He whispered a silent prayer of thanks that he'd found the abandoned bride before she met a similar fate. When he returned to the main room, Eleanor was seated by the fire in one of Catherine's old nightgowns, a thick quilt wrapped around her shoulders. Her golden hair, now dry and falling in waves down her back, caught the firelight. Her skin had regained some color and her green eyes, though still haunted, were alert. "Thank you for saving my life," she said softly as he approached. "I'm Eleanor Vaughn, Roy Dawson," he replied, taking a seat across from her. "Would you mind telling me how you came to be alone in a blizzard wearing a wedding dress?" Eleanor's hands tightened around the mug of hot tea Mrs. Wilson had given her. "I came from Boston to marry Charles Blackstone. We were engaged for 6 months. He traveled east on business and we met at a social gathering." Her voice grew bitter. "He seemed so genuine, so devoted. My parents were thrilled when he asked for my hand. They provided a generous dowry." Roy's jaw tightened. "Blackstone," he spat. "I know the man. He's no rancher, though he pretends to be. Comes through these parts every year or so with some new scheme." "He never intended to marry me," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "When I arrived today, I overheard him telling someone that he'd secured my family's money and had no need for a wife. When I confronted him, She paused, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "He pushed me from the stagecoach and left me to die." Mrs. Wilson, who'd been listening from the kitchen doorway, made a sound of outrage. "That man should be horse-whipped." Roy leaned forward, his expression serious. "Miss Vaughn, when this storm clears, I'll ride into town and speak with Sheriff Taylor. What Blackstone did wasn't just cruel, it was attempted murder." Eleanor nodded gratefully, but her eyes remained troubled. "Even if he's caught, I have nowhere to go. I can't return to Boston in disgrace, and I have no other family or connections here." "You'll stay with us until we sort things out," Roy said firmly. "It's not much, but you'll be safe here." "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition," Roy interrupted. "The children will be delighted to have company." At the mention of children, Eleanor's expression softened. "You have children?" "Thomas is 8 and Sarah is 6, he answered, a smile warming his features. "They're good kids. Their mother, Catherine, passed 3 years ago." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said, genuine compassion in her voice. Mrs. Wilson patted Eleanor's shoulder. "That's enough talk for tonight. You need rest, dear. You can take my room, I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly, I insist," the older woman said firmly. "Roy, help her to my room, would you? I'll check on the children." Roy offered Eleanor his arm, which she took gratefully. As they walked slowly to the bedroom, she was acutely aware of his strength, his solid presence beside her. Despite the horrors of the day, she felt an odd sense of peace in this humble home. "Thank you," she said again as they reached the bedroom door. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Roy's blue eyes met hers, serious and intense. "I'm just glad I was there." "Get some rest, Miss Vaughn. You're safe now." As Eleanor settled into the unfamiliar bed, she found herself thinking of Roy Dawson's kind eyes and the gentle way he'd carried her to safety. For the first time since discovering Charles's betrayal, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this wasn't the end of her story, but rather an unexpected beginning. Morning arrived with brilliant sunlight reflecting off the snow-covered landscape. The blizzard had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white. Eleanor woke to the sound of children's laughter and the aroma of coffee and something sweet baking. She dressed quickly in clothes Mrs. Wilson had laid out for her, a simple blue calico dress that had belonged to Catherine. It was slightly large on her slender frame, but clean and warm. After braiding her long hair, she made her way to the main room. 2 children looked up as she entered, their curious eyes widening. The boy, with his father's dark hair and blue eyes, stood protectively beside his younger sister, who had chestnut curls and a sprinkling of freckles across her nose. "Good morning," Eleanor said softly. "You must be Thomas and Sarah." Thomas nodded solemnly, but Sarah rushed forward, her shyness overcome by childish curiosity. "Are you the lady Papa rescued from the snow? He said you were wearing a wedding dress. Were you a princess?" Eleanor couldn't help but smile. "Not a princess, I'm afraid, just a very foolish woman who trusted the wrong person." Sarah, don't pester our guest, Roy said, entering from the kitchen with a steaming mug of coffee. He offered it to Eleanor with a smile that transformed his serious face. How are you feeling this morning? Much better, thank you, she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Though I'm still overwhelmed by your kindness, Roy shrugged. Any decent person would have done the same. Mrs. Wilson emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of fresh biscuits. But not everyone would open their home to a stranger, Roy Dawson. You're a good man. She turned to Eleanor. Come eat, dear, you need your strength. Over breakfast, Eleanor found herself drawn into the family's warm dynamic. Thomas was serious like his father, but possessed a quick intelligence that showed in his thoughtful questions. Sarah was all sunshine and chatter, eager to tell Eleanor about her doll collection and her favorite stories. Roy watched his children with obvious pride, occasionally catching Eleanor's eye with a smile that made her heart skip. After the meal, Roy announced he would ride into Jefferson to speak with the sheriff about Charles Blackstone. Can I come too, Papa? Thomas asked eagerly. Roy ruffled his son's hair. Not today, son. I need you here to help look after Miss Vaughn and your sister. Thomas's disappointment was obvious, but he nodded bravely. Yes, sir. I'll return before sundown, Roy promised, pulling on his heavy coat. He hesitated at the door, looking back at Eleanor. Will you be all right here? She nodded. Of course, please be careful. Always am, he replied with a slight smile before heading out into the blinding white landscape. The day passed quickly, as Eleanor found herself absorbed into the household routine. Mrs. Wilson taught her how to make a proper stew, laughing good-naturedly at Eleanor's inexperienced attempts to chop vegetables. Sarah insisted on showing Eleanor her treasured possessions, including a small wooden horse Roy had carved for her birthday. Thomas remained more reserved, but gradually warmed to Eleanor as she showed genuine interest in the book about explorers he was reading. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor was helping Mrs. Wilson fold laundry while the children played a game of checkers near the fire. The domesticity of the scene struck her forcefully how different this was from the grand life she'd imagined with Charles, and yet how much more genuine it felt. He's a good father, Mrs. Wilson commented, following Eleanor's gaze to where Thomas was patiently explaining a move to his younger sister. Hasn't been easy for him since Catherine passed, but he's managed. Those children are his whole world. What happened to their mother? Eleanor asked quietly. Mrs. Wilson sighed. Influenza. Swept through these parts 3 winters ago. Catherine caught it while nursing Sarah back to health. The child recovered, but Catherine, she was gone within a week. She placed a weathered hand over Eleanor's. Roy's never said as much, but I think he blames himself for not being able to save her. Eleanor's heart ached at the thought. That's not fair to himself. No, it isn't, Mrs. Wilson agreed, but grief isn't always rational, is it? He's devoted himself to those children ever since, working himself to the bone to provide for them. This ranch was Catherine's dream as much as his, you see. He couldn't bear to leave it, even when times got hard. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Thomas jumped up from the checkers game, rushing to the window. Papa's back, and there's someone with him. Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. Had Roy found Charles? Was he bringing him to confront her? The door opened, and Roy stomped the snow from his boots before entering, followed by a grim-faced man wearing a sheriff's badge. Miss Vaughn, Roy said, his expression carefully neutral, this is Sheriff Taylor. He'd like to speak with you about what happened yesterday. Sheriff Taylor was a tall, lean man with graying hair and kind eyes that belied his stern countenance. He removed his hat respectfully. Madam, Mr. Dawson here has told me a troubling tale. I'd be grateful if you could give me your account of what happened. Eleanor recounted her story in as much detail as she could manage, from her engagement to Charles in Boston to the horrific moment he pushed her from the stagecoach. The sheriff listened attentively, occasionally jotting notes in a small book. This is a serious matter, Miss Vaughn, he said when she finished. Abandoning someone in a blizzard is attempted murder in my book. The problem is, Blackstone and the stagecoach continued on to Helena. By the time word reaches them, he could be halfway to California. So he'll get away with it. Eleanor asked, dismayed. The sheriff shook his head. I'm sending telegrams to every law enforcement office between here and the coast. He won't escape justice, Miss Vaughn. Your testimony is compelling, and I've known Roy Dawson for years. His word carries weight with me. We'll find Blackstone. And my family's money? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Sheriff Taylor's expression softened. I'm afraid that may be more difficult to recover, madam, but we'll do our best. After the sheriff departed with a promise to send word of any developments, Eleanor sat heavily in a chair by the fire. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She was stranded in an unfamiliar territory with no money, no connections, and no prospects. What will I do now? She whispered, more to herself than to Roy, who had remained standing nearby. You'll stay here until things are sorted out, he said firmly. Eleanor shook her head. I can't impose on your family indefinitely. You've been more than generous, but Miss Vaughn. Eleanor, Roy interrupted, taking a seat beside her and speaking quietly so the children, now back at their game, couldn't overhear. I understand your pride, but there's no shame in accepting help when you need it. Jefferson isn't Boston. Folks look out for each other here because survival depends on it. His directness was both startling and comforting. Eleanor studied his face, the strong jaw partially hidden by his beard, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. There was a steadiness to him that Charles had never possessed. I'm not used to being dependent, she admitted. In Boston, I had my own charitable projects, my own responsibilities. Roy nodded thoughtfully. There's plenty of work to be done here if that's your worry. Mrs. Wilson isn't getting any younger, and she's been helping me with the children and the house since Catherine died. She has her own home to look after too. The idea of being useful, of earning her keep, appealed to Eleanor. I'm afraid I'm not very experienced with ranch work. A hint of a smile touched Roy's lips. I noticed your struggles with those carrots earlier, but you learn quickly, I can tell, and the children seem to have taken to you. As if on cue, Sarah bounded over, her game with Thomas apparently finished. Miss Eleanor, can you read me a story? Thomas says he's too old for fairy tales now. Eleanor looked to Roy, who nodded encouragingly. I'd love to, Sarah, she said, allowing the little girl to take her hand and lead her to a small bookshelf. As she settled in a chair with Sarah on her lap and a well-worn copy of Cinderella in her hands, Eleanor caught Roy watching them with an unreadable expression. For a fleeting moment, she imagined herself as part of this family, not just a temporary guest, but someone who belonged here. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of new experiences for Eleanor. True to her word, she threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life. Mrs. Wilson proved an enthusiastic teacher, showing Eleanor how to cook hearty meals over the wood stove, how to make soap from lye and fat, and how to preserve the vegetables stored in the root cellar. To her surprise, Eleanor found satisfaction in these practical skills that had never been part of her genteel Boston upbringing. The children quickly adapted to her presence. Sarah attached herself to Eleanor like a shadow, delighting in having someone to show her drawings to and to braid her hair in the mornings. Thomas remained more reserved, but gradually began including Eleanor in his conversations about books and his dreams of one day exploring the West. Roy was often busy with ranch work, especially as the snow began to melt and preparations for spring planting needed to be made. Eleanor would watch from the kitchen window as he chopped wood or repaired fences, his powerful frame moving with an efficiency born of years of physical labor. Occasionally, he would glance toward the house and raise a hand in greeting when he spotted her, causing an unexpected warmth to bloom in her chest. In the evenings, they would gather around the fire as a family. Mrs. Wilson usually retired early to her small cabin nearby, leaving Eleanor with Roy and the children. These quiet hours became Eleanor's favorite time of day. Sometimes, Roy would tell stories of his younger days as a cowhand before he'd settled down with Catherine. Other times, they would simply sit in comfortable silence, Roy carving wooden figures for the children while Eleanor mended clothes. It was during one such evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, that Eleanor became acutely aware of how naturally she had slipped into this domestic tableau. Sarah was already asleep in her lap and Thomas was nodding off over his book. Roy sat across from her, his hands deftly working a piece of pine into what looked like a small deer. "They've become quite attached to you," he said softly, nodding toward his sleeping daughter. Eleanor stroked Sarah's hair gently. "And I to them," she admitted. "They're wonderful children, Roy." His eyes, when they met hers, held a warmth that made her breath catch. "They haven't been this content since their mother died. You've brought something back to this house that was missing." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. "I'm grateful you found me in that storm, not just for saving my life, but for bringing me here." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the children. Eleanor found herself studying Roy's face in the firelight, noting the way his strong hands moved with surprising gentleness over the carving. He was nothing like the sophisticated men she had known in Boston, and yet there was a depth to him that made those men seem shallow in comparison. "I received word from Sheriff Taylor today," Roy said eventually, his tone careful. "They've located Blackstone in Sacramento." Eleanor tensed, causing Sarah to stir slightly. "Oh," she said, uncertain how to feel about this news. "They've arrested him, but recovering your dowry will be complicated. The sheriff says you may need to travel to California to testify." The thought of leaving this peaceful ranch to face Charles again filled Eleanor with dread. "I see." Roy set aside his carving, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he said quietly. "The money. Is it worth facing him again?" Eleanor considered the question. The dowry had been substantial enough to secure her future. And yet the thought of confronting Charles, of reliving his betrayal, made her stomach clench. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "That money was my security. Without it—" "You have security here," Roy said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. When she looked up, surprised, he continued with careful words. "What I mean is, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. The children adore you and you've become important to this household." The unspoken sentiment behind his words hung in the air between them. Eleanor's heart raced as she realized what Roy might be suggesting. Their moment was interrupted by Thomas stirring and sitting up. "Is it time for bed?" he asked sleepily. Roy cleared his throat, the intensity of the moment broken. "Yes, son, let's get you and your sister tucked in." As Eleanor helped settle Sarah in her bed, her mind whirled with the implications of Roy's words. Had he been about to suggest a more permanent arrangement? And more importantly, how did she feel about such a possibility? Later, as she lay in her borrowed bed, Eleanor found herself comparing Roy Dawson to Charles Blackstone. Charles had been all surface charm, handsome, sophisticated, and ultimately hollow. Roy was different. His quiet strength, his devotion to his children, his unfailing kindness, these qualities had snuck past Eleanor's defenses when she wasn't looking, with a startling clarity. Eleanor realized she was falling in love with the taciturn rancher who had saved her life. The revelation should have frightened her after her recent heartbreak, but instead, it filled her with a quiet certainty. Whatever happened with Charles and her dowry, Eleanor knew that her future had irrevocably shifted course on that snowy night when Roy Dawson had found her. Spring arrived in Jefferson with a sudden burst of color and activity. The snow melted rapidly, revealing muddy fields that would soon be ready for planting. Birds returned from their southern sojourn, filling the air with song, and the ranch came alive with the sounds of newborn calves and the constant work of the season. Eleanor embraced the rhythms of spring with enthusiasm, helping Roy plant a vegetable garden and learning to ride one of the gentler horses so she could assist with simpler ranch tasks. Her city-bred hands grew calloused, and her fair skin tanned under the Montana sun, but she had never felt more alive. The matter of Charles Blackstone continued to hang over her, however. Sheriff Taylor had sent several telegrams updating them on the legal proceedings. Charles was fighting the charges, claiming Eleanor had chosen to leave the stagecoach of her own accord. Without witnesses beyond the stagecoach driver, who appeared to be in Charles's pocket, the case was proving difficult. One warm April morning, Eleanor was hanging laundry in the yard while watching Sarah and Thomas playing nearby when she spotted a rider approaching. Roy, who had been mending a fence at the edge of the property, straightened and walked toward the visitor. Eleanor recognized Sheriff Taylor's tall figure as he dismounted and greeted Roy with a handshake. The two men spoke for several minutes, their serious expressions causing anxiety to flutter in Eleanor's stomach. Finally, they both turned and walked toward her. "Miss Vaughn," Sheriff Taylor said, removing his hat, "I'm afraid I have some news that couldn't wait for a telegram." "Has something happened with Charles?" she asked, instinctively reaching for Sarah as the little girl ran to her side. The sheriff nodded grimly. "He's escaped custody. Bribed a guard and disappeared 2 nights ago. We've got men searching, but—" He shook his head. "I thought you should know, there's a chance he might come looking for you given how his plans were disrupted." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Here, but how would he know where I am?" "Jefferson ain't that big a place, madam. Word gets around. I've got men watching the roads into town, but I wanted to warn you to be vigilant." Roy's expression had hardened into a mask of controlled anger. "He won't get anywhere near her or my children," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff." After Sheriff Taylor departed, promising to send regular updates, Roy turned to Eleanor. His blue eyes were intense with concern. "I won't let him hurt you," he said firmly. "This is your home now, and I protect what's mine. Your home, what's mine." The possessive terms sent a shiver through Eleanor that had nothing to do with fear. "Roy," she said quietly, aware of the children still within earshot, "we should talk about what happens next." He nodded, understanding her meaning. "Tonight, after the children are asleep." The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension for Eleanor. She found herself jumping at every sound, peering anxiously out windows whenever she passed them. Roy stayed closer to the house than usual, his rifle never far from reach. The children, sensitive to the adult's mood, were unusually subdued. That evening, after Thomas and Sarah were finally asleep, Eleanor joined Roy by the fire. Mrs. Wilson had left earlier, giving Eleanor's hand a squeeze of support before departing. They were alone, truly alone, for the first time since her arrival. "Eleanor," Roy began, setting aside the coffee cup he'd been holding, "I need to say something, and I'd appreciate if you'd let me get through it before responding." She nodded, heart pounding. "When I found you in that blizzard, I was just doing what any decent man would do. I didn't expect—" He paused, searching for words. "I didn't expect you to change everything. The children haven't been this happy since their mother died. This house feels like a home again, not just a place we exist in." He leaned forward, his earnest gaze holding hers. "I know it's been a short time and you might think I'm being foolish or hasty, but I've come to care for you deeply. More than care, I love you, Eleanor. I love the way you are with my children. I love your determination to learn our ways even when it's difficult. I love your kindness and your strength." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as Roy continued, "I'm not offering you wealth or the kind of life you might have had in Boston. All I have is this ranch, my children, and my promise to protect and cherish you for as long as I live." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. I'm asking if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife, of being a mother to Thomas and Sarah, of building a life here with us." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as the full impact of his proposal washed over her. This wasn't the calculated arrangement Charles had offered. This was a declaration of love, honest and profound. "Roy," she began, voice trembling with emotion, "when Charles abandoned me, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see a future beyond my shame and despair. But you didn't just save my life that night. You gave me a new one. She reached out, taking his weathered hands in hers. I love you too. I love your children as if they were my own. And yes, I would be honored to be your wife. The joy that transformed Roy's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He slipped the gold band onto her finger, then drew her into a tender embrace. When his lips met hers, Eleanor felt as though she had finally, truly come home. Their moment of happiness was brutally interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. Roy pulled away sharply, instantly alert. "Stay here," he ordered, reaching for his rifle. Before he could move toward the window, the front door burst open, revealing Charles Blackstone, his once handsome face twisted with rage and a revolver clutched in his hand. "How touching," he sneered, his gaze flicking between Roy and Eleanor. "My runaway bride has found herself a rustic replacement." Roy stepped protectively in front of Eleanor, his rifle aimed steadily at Charles. "Get out of my house, Blackstone," Charles laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "Your house? With my money, I don't think so. Do you know how much her family paid me to take this frigid bitch off their hands? A small fortune. And I intend to collect what's mine. The only thing that will be collected tonight is your corpse if you don't lower that gun," Roy said, his voice deadly calm. "The sheriff knows you're wanted." "This won't end well for you." Charles's expression flickered with uncertainty, but the revolver in his hand remained pointed at Roy. "The sheriff is currently occupied with a fire at the livery stable. Convenient diversion, wouldn't you say? Now, Eleanor, get your things. You're coming with me." Eleanor moved to stand beside Roy, her fear overwhelmed by a surge of protective fury. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Charles. You left me to die in that blizzard. If not for Roy, I would be dead." "A pity my plan didn't succeed the first time," Charles snarled. "I won't make the same mistake twice." What happened next occurred with frightening speed. Charles raised his revolver, aiming directly at Eleanor. Roy lunged forward, pushing her aside as a shot rang out. Eleanor screamed as Roy staggered, blood blossoming on his left shoulder. Despite the wound, Roy managed to maintain his grip on his rifle. As Charles prepared to fire again, Roy squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the small cabin. Charles's eyes widened in shock as the bullet struck him square in the chest. He collapsed to the floor, the revolver falling from his lifeless fingers. "Papa?" Thomas's terrified voice came from the hallway. He stood there in his nightshirt, Sarah cowering behind him, both children pale with fear. "It's all right," Roy said through gritted teeth, though the growing bloodstain on his shirt suggested otherwise. "Stay back, children. Eleanor, check if he's alive." With shaking hands, Eleanor approached Charles's prone form. The stillness of his body and the vacant stare of his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "He's dead," she confirmed, a complex mixture of relief and horror washing over her. "Papa, you're hurt?" Sarah cried, breaking free from her brother to rush to Roy's side. Eleanor quickly took charge, her panic subsiding in the face of immediate need. "Thomas, bring me clean cloths from the kitchen. Sarah, fetch the medical box from the shelf. Quickly now." As the children hurried to obey, Eleanor helped Roy to a chair, easing his injured arm from his shirt to assess the wound. "It looks like the bullet went through cleanly," she said, relief evident in her voice. "You'll need stitches, but if we can stop the bleeding." Roy's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite his pain. "Are you all right?" The simple question, asked while he sat bleeding from a wound he'd taken protecting her, broke something open in Eleanor's heart. "Oh, Roy," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," he said firmly. "And neither were you or the children. That's what matters." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor cleaned and bandaged Roy's wound as best she could, grateful for the first aid skills Mrs. Wilson had taught her. Thomas, displaying a maturity beyond his 8 years, helped her move Charles's body to the barn, covering it with a sheet until the sheriff could be notified. Sarah remained by her father's side, her small face serious as she handed Eleanor supplies and whispered reassurances to Roy. By dawn, exhaustion had overtaken them all. Roy rested in his bed, his wound properly dressed and his color improved. The children, finally convinced their father would recover, had fallen asleep in chairs beside him. Eleanor sat watching over all three, her heart full of a fierce love that surprised her with its intensity. When Sheriff Taylor arrived later that morning, having finally contained the fire at the livery stable, he found a family united by crisis. After hearing their account and examining Charles's body, he declared the shooting a clear case of self-defense. Blackstone was wanted for fraud in 3 territories, the sheriff explained as he prepared to transport the body back to town. You did the community a service, Roy. Though I'm sorry you had to be the one to end him. Roy, pale but steadfast, nodded grimly from where he sat propped up in a kitchen chair. I'd do it again to protect my family, he said, his gaze moving to Eleanor and the children. The word family resonated in the room, affirming what the night's events had proven: they belonged together, bound by love stronger than blood. In the weeks that followed, news of Charles Blackstone's demise spread throughout Jefferson and beyond. To Eleanor's surprise, a letter arrived from Boston. Her parents, having learned of Charles's deception and her near-death experience, expressed their profound regret and offered to send funds for her return journey. Eleanor sat on the porch swing with Roy, his arm healing nicely as they read the letter together. They want me to come home, she said softly. They say all is forgiven, as if I were the one who needed forgiveness. Roy's hand tightened around hers, though his expression remained carefully neutral. You want to go back? She looked out at the ranch spread before them, the fields ready for summer planting, the children playing with the new foal in the paddock, the mountains rising majestic in the distance. Then she turned to Roy, seeing the love and uncertainty in his eyes. No, she said firmly, this is my home now. You and the children are my family. She held up her hand where his mother's ring still circled her finger. I made my choice, Roy Dawson, and I don't regret it for a moment. The relief in his smile was like sunshine after rain. He pulled her close, mindful of his healing shoulder, and pressed a tender kiss to her forehead. I was thinking we might have the wedding next month once the spring planting is done. Nothing fancy, just our friends and neighbors. That sounds perfect, Eleanor agreed, resting her head on his uninjured shoulder. I never did get to be a proper bride after all. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children's antics with the foal. Finally, Roy spoke, his voice thoughtful. You know, when I found you in that blizzard, I remember thinking you looked like an angel in that snow. It didn't seem real, this beautiful woman in a wedding dress appearing out of nowhere. Eleanor laughed softly. I was hardly angelic, more like a half-frozen fool. No, Roy said seriously. You were exactly what we needed, even though we didn't know it yet. When I brought you home that night, I carried you in and looked at my sleeping children, and something just whispered inside me. What did it whisper? Eleanor asked, intrigued by this revelation. Roy's eyes, so blue and honest, met hers. It said, my children need you, and I think I needed you too, though I wasn't ready to admit it then. The simple confession moved Eleanor deeply. She leaned in to kiss him, a gentle meeting of lips that held the promise of their shared future. Their wedding took place on a perfect June day, with wildflowers blooming across the Montana meadows and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. The entire community of Jefferson turned out for the occasion, filling the small church and spilling out onto the grounds. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Wilson and several other women from town had helped her make, adorned with ribbons and lace sent by her mother as a peace offering. Thomas stood proudly at his father's side, serving as best man despite his tender age. Sarah scattered wildflower petals along the aisle, beaming with importance in her role as flower girl. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be wed, it was Thomas who stepped forward, his young voice steady as he declared, "Her family does. Sarah and me and Pa." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as Roy and Eleanor exchanged their vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the seasons of their lives. When Roy slipped a new gold band alongside his mother's ring on Eleanor's finger, his hands trembled slightly with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister announced, his weathered face creased in a wide smile. "Mr. Dawson, you may kiss your bride." Roy gathered Eleanor into his arms with reverent tenderness, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that sealed their union before God and community. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, Thomas and Sarah rushed forward to embrace them both, transforming the moment into a family celebration. The reception that followed at the Dawson Ranch was a joyous affair, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and everyone contributing food and drink. Fiddle music filled the air as couples danced on a wooden platform constructed specially for the occasion. Eleanor found herself passed from partner to partner as the men of Jefferson welcomed her officially to their community, but her eyes always sought out Roy, finding him watching her with a contentment that warmed her from within. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Roy claimed his bride for a dance, holding her close as they swayed to a slow melody. "Happy Mrs. Dawson," he murmured against her hair. "Completely," she assured him, tilting her face up for a kiss. "Though I think our children are even happier. Look at them." They both turned to watch Thomas and Sarah, who were being fawned over by a group of elderly ladies. The children were practically glowing with pride in their new family status. "They've been planning to call you Mama starting today," Roy confided. "They asked me if it would be all right. I told them it was up to you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Nothing would honor me more." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Roy carried his bride across the threshold of their bedroom. The space had been transformed in Eleanor's absence that day. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, new linens adorned the bed, and wildflowers filled a pottery vase on the dresser. "The women of Jefferson have been busy," Eleanor observed, touched by their thoughtfulness. "They wanted to welcome you properly," Roy said, setting her gently on her feet. "This community takes care of its own, and you're one of us now." As they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Eleanor felt the last shadows of her painful past recede completely. In their place bloomed a certainty that she had found her true destiny in this rugged land with this good man and his children. 1 year later, Eleanor sat in the same bedroom, cradling a newborn son in her arms. The baby, just hours old, had his father's dark hair and strong features. Thomas and Sarah crowded around, their faces alight with wonder at their new brother. "He's so tiny," Sarah whispered, gently touching the baby's perfect fingers. "You were even smaller when you were born." Thomas informed her with brotherly superiority, though his own expression was equally awed. Roy sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Eleanor's shoulders, his free hand gently stroking his new son's cheek. "Have you decided on a name?" he asked her. They had discussed several possibilities but had agreed Eleanor would make the final choice after meeting their child. She looked down at the peaceful face of their son, then up at the two children who had so readily accepted her as their mother. Finally, her gaze met Roy's, seeing in his eyes the same love and gratitude she felt in her own heart. "William," she decided. "William Roy Dawson. After your father and you." Roy's smile was tender as he leaned down to kiss first his wife, then his newborn son. "Welcome to the world, William," he murmured. "You have quite a family waiting to love you." Eleanor leaned back against the pillows, surrounded by her family, and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The abandoned bride in a blizzard seemed like someone from another lifetime, a frightened young woman who couldn't have imagined the happiness awaiting her. The betrayal that had seemed like an ending had, in fact, been the beginning of a far more beautiful story than she could have written for herself. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" Sarah asked, noticing Eleanor's contemplative expression. Eleanor smiled, drawing her daughter closer with her free arm. "I was just thinking about how sometimes, What seems like our worst day can lead us to our best life. Roy's eyes met hers over the children's heads, understanding and love passing between them in that silent exchange. He knew she was thinking of that snowy night, of the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. "I thank God every day for that blizzard," he said softly, "and for the courage it took for you to stay." As the family gathered close around the newest Dawson, the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, bathing them in golden warmth. Outside, the ranch continued its daily rhythms, cattle grazing in the distance, crops ripening in the fields, the endless Montana sky stretching blue above it all. Eleanor Dawson, once Eleanor Vaughn of Boston, gazed at her husband and children and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The abandoned bride had found not just shelter from the storm, but a love as vast and enduring as the western landscape itself. 5 years later, the Dawson Ranch had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. Roy's careful management, combined with Eleanor's head for business, had transformed their modest operation into one of the most successful in the territory. They had added a new wing to the house to accommodate their growing family, which now included William, 4, and twin girls, Rebecca and Rachel, who had just celebrated their second birthday. Thomas, now 13, had grown into a thoughtful young man who excelled at school and helped his father with increasing responsibility on the ranch. Sarah, 11, was the spitting image of her mother Catherine in looks, but had inherited Eleanor's love of books and learning. William, a sturdy, active boy, followed his older brother everywhere, while the twins toddled about the house and yard, bringing joy and chaos in equal measure. On a warm September evening, the family gathered on the extended front porch after supper. The older children were playing a game of checkers while the little ones were already drowsy, ready for bed. Roy sat in his favorite rocking chair, watching Eleanor as she finished braiding Sarah's hair for the night. "There you go, sweetheart," Eleanor said, tying off the braid with a ribbon. "Now, why don't you and Thomas take William and the twins inside and get everyone ready for bed? Papa and I will be in soon for stories." The children obediently began gathering their things, with Thomas scooping up one twin while Sarah took charge of the other. William trailed after them, already in his nightshirt and yawning widely. Once they were alone, Roy held out his hand to Eleanor, drawing her onto his lap when she took it. "Have I told you today how much I love you, Mrs. Dawson?" he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, savoring the quiet moment. "Only 3 times," she teased. "You're falling behind." Roy chuckled, his arms tightening around her waist. "Well then, let me be clear. I love you more today than yesterday, but not as much as I will tomorrow." "Quite the poet you've become," Eleanor said, though she couldn't hide how his words pleased her. After 5 years of marriage, they had settled into a comfortable rhythm, but Roy never let a day pass without reminding her of his love. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Finally, Roy spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I had a letter from your parents today. They're planning to visit next month if that suits you." Eleanor nodded, smiling. "I'd like that. It's been 2 years since they were here last. They haven't even met the twins in person yet." The relationship with her parents had been gradually repaired over the years. Their first visit, shortly after William's birth, had been tense at times, as her Boston-bred parents adjusted to the realities of ranch life. But they had come to respect Roy and adore their grandchildren, and each subsequent visit had been easier. "Your father mentioned he might be interested in investing in that new grain storage facility we've been discussing," Roy continued. "Says he trusts your business sense more than any of his advisors back east." Eleanor laughed softly. That would have shocked him speechless 6 years ago. "He never thought his daughter would have a head for commerce." "His daughter has a head for everything," Roy said proudly. "Best decision I ever made, marrying you. Even better than that time you decided to track a stagecoach in a blizzard." Eleanor asked, her tone light though the memory still held power. Roy's expression grew serious as he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "That wasn't a decision, that was fate. I believe with all my heart that God meant for me to find you that day." Eleanor leaned forward to kiss him, her heart full of the same certainty. "Then I thank God for that blizzard, and for the man who braved it." From inside the house came the sound of a child's wail, followed by Thomas's voice calling, "Mama, Papa, the twins are fighting over the wooden horse again." Roy and Eleanor exchanged a look of fond exasperation before rising from the chair. Hand in hand, they walked into their home, ready to soothe ruffled feathers and tell bedtime stories, secure in the knowledge that the love they had found in the most unlikely of circumstances would continue to sustain them through all the challenges and joys of their shared life. As Eleanor tucked the last child into bed that night, she paused in the doorway, watching Roy as he bent to kiss each small forehead. The words he had whispered to her on that fateful night, "My children need you," had proven prophetic in ways neither of them could have imagined. Not only had she become mother to his children, but she had given him more, expanding their family and their hearts. Roy looked up, catching her watching him. The love in his eyes was as clear and true as it had been on their wedding day, perhaps even deeper for all they had shared since. Eleanor smiled back, wordlessly acknowledging what they both knew, that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive in the midst of the fiercest storms, if only we have the courage to open our doors and welcome them in.